Sometimes life hits you when you're already down, and Jake Matthews knew that feeling all too well. As a single father working 3 jobs just to keep the lights on, he was used to people looking at him with pity in their eyes. When his estranged father died and left him an old gas station, everyone in town laughed. The place was falling apart with broken pumps and cracked pavement. His neighbors called it worthless junk. His ex-wife said he was wasting his time. But Jake needed hope for his 8-year-old son, Tommy, so he decided to fix up the station. While cleaning out the back office, Jake found old papers hidden in the walls. These weren't just any papers. They were oil surveys from 1987 showing massive untapped reserves beneath the property. The worthless gas station was actually sitting on $200 million worth of oil. But when dangerous people learned about Jake's discovery, would he be able to protect his son and keep what was rightfully theirs? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The alarm clock screamed at 4:30 a.m., just like it had every morning for the past 3 years. Jake Matthews rolled out of bed in the cramped 2-bedroom apartment he shared with his son Tommy, his joints protesting the early hour and the weight of exhaustion that never seemed to lift. The thin walls couldn't hide the sound of Mrs. Patterson's television next door, already blaring the morning news at a volume that suggested she'd given up on peaceful sleep long ago. Jake shuffled to the small kitchen, stepping carefully around Tommy's backpack and the pile of bills that had taken permanent residence on their second-hand table. Coffee was a luxury they couldn't always afford, but this morning he allowed himself half a cup from yesterday's grounds. The bitter taste matched his mood as he stared at Tommy's report card, still lying where he'd left it the night before. "Straight A's again," he whispered to the empty kitchen, pride and worry warring in his chest. Tommy was brilliant, too brilliant for a kid who ate generic cereal for dinner 3 nights a week and wore hand-me-down clothes from the church donation box. At 8 years old, he already understood that Daddy worked a lot of jobs, and that meant saying no to things other kids took for granted. School, field trips, birthday parties at the arcade, even a simple ice cream cone. Each request was met with Jake's careful explanation that they had to save money for important things. The irony wasn't lost on Jake that his father, Robert Matthews, had died 3 weeks ago with enough money to buy a decent car, but had chosen instead to leave behind a derelict gas station that everyone in Millbrook considered an eyesore. The lawyer, Mr. Henderson, had been apologetic when he'd delivered the news. "I'm sorry, Mr. Matthews," Henderson had said, adjusting his glasses nervously. "Your father's will is quite straightforward. He left you the property at 1847 Highway 9 Sunset Gas Station. There are some debts against the property, but the land itself is yours." Jake remembered staring at the deed, feeling a familiar surge of anger toward the man who had walked out when Jake was 12 and never looked back. Even in death, Robert Matthews managed to burden his son with something nobody wanted. The shower lasted exactly 3 minutes, long enough to wake up, not long enough to use too much hot water. Jake dressed in his work clothes, worn jeans, a flannel shirt that had seen better decades, and steel-toed boots that were more duct tape than leather at this point. His first job started at 6 a.m. at Morrison's Auto Repair, where Frank Morrison paid him cash under the table to do the work nobody else wanted to tackle. Tommy emerged from his bedroom right on schedule, hair sticking up in directions that defied physics, clutching the stuffed elephant that had been his constant companion since he was 2. Sarah had bought that elephant during their brief period of happiness, back when they were planning a future together instead of fighting over custody arrangements and child support payments. "Morning, Dad," Tommy said, his voice still thick with sleep. "Morning, buddy. You got everything for school?" Tommy nodded, already moving with the efficient routine of a child who'd learned not to expect help with the small details. He poured his own cereal, made his own lunch, and packed his own backpack, while Jake gathered his tools for the day. They had their system down to a science. They had to. The walk to Tommy's school took 15 minutes through the heart of Millbrook, a town that had been slowly dying since the textile mill closed in 1998. Main Street was a collection of empty storefronts and businesses, hanging on by threads of stubbornness and community loyalty. Chen's Diner was one of the survivors, its neon sign flickering with the promise of coffee strong enough to wake the dead, and breakfast served all day. Mrs. Chen waved from behind the counter as they passed, her weathered face creasing into a smile. She'd been trying to hire Jake as a part-time cook for months, but the hours conflicted with his delivery job for Peterson's pharmacy. In a town where everyone knew everyone else's business, Mrs. Chen understood the delicate mathematics of survival that governed Jake's life. "You know," Tommy said as they reached the school steps, "Kevin Morrison says his dad might hire you full-time at the shop." Jake knelt down to Tommy's eye level, a habit from when his son was smaller, but one he couldn't bring himself to abandon. "Kevin's dad pays me what he can afford, buddy. Sometimes people want to help, but they can't always do everything they want to do." Tommy nodded, with the serious expression of a child who'd been forced to understand adult problems too early. "Like how you want to take me to see the new superhero movie, but we have to wait for the dollar theater." "Exactly like that." Jake ruffled his son's hair, feeling the familiar ache in his chest. "You okay walking home with Mrs. Henderson after school? I've got the delivery route until 6. "Yeah, Dad. She lets me help sort the pharmacy bags. Says I'm good at organizing." Jake watched Tommy disappear through the school doors, his small figure swallowed by the crowd of children whose biggest worry was whether they'd packed the right folder for math class. Then he turned and began the 2-mile walk to Morrison's, where Frank would already be 3 cups of coffee deep and ready to assign Jake the jobs that required crawling under cars in 40-degree weather. Frank Morrison was one of the few people in town who'd never treated Jake with the particular brand of sympathy reserved for men whose lives had taken obvious wrong turns. He was 63, built like a fire hydrant, and had opinions about everything from carburetor repair to the declining state of American manufacturing. His shop was a testament to his belief that things should be built to last. Every tool had been maintained with religious devotion, and the building itself was solid brick and mortar from an era when craftsmanship mattered. "Heard about your old man's gift from beyond the grave," Frank said, without looking up from the engine block he was rebuilding. "That gas station's been an eyesore since Reagan was president." Jake pulled on his work gloves and grabbed the toolbox Frank had designated as his. "Everyone's got an opinion about what I should do with it. Most folks around here think you should bulldoze it and sell the lot. Might get enough to put a down payment on a better place for you and Tommy. And what do you think?" Frank finally looked up, his eyes sharp despite their faded blue color. "I think a man's got a right to make his own mistakes, but I also think you ought to take a look at the place before you decide anything. Sometimes what looks like junk on the surface has good bones underneath." Jake spent the morning replacing brake pads on Mrs. Patterson's ancient Buick, the same car that had been making the same squealing noise for 2 years because she couldn't afford to fix everything wrong with it at once. It was a familiar story in Millbrook, people making do with what they had, stretching every dollar until it screamed for mercy, finding ways to coax a little more life out of things that should have been replaced years ago. At lunch, Jake sat on the loading dock behind Morrison's and called the number Mr. Henderson had given him for the utilities at Sunset Gas Station. The electric company informed him that the power had been shut off for non-payment 6 months ago. The gas company said they'd need a full inspection before restoring service. The county clerk's office had a list of code violations dating back 5 years. By the time Jake finished his delivery route for Peterson's pharmacy, the sun was setting behind the hills that surrounded Millbrook like protective arms. He picked up Tommy from Mrs. Henderson's house, where his son had apparently spent the afternoon helping organize medical supplies with the efficiency of a seasoned inventory clerk. "Mrs. Henderson says I have good attention to detail," Tommy announced as they walked home. "She thinks I might be good at being a pharmacist someday. What do you think about that?" Tommy considered this with the seriousness he applied to all career-related discussions. "I think it would be nice to help people feel better. And Mrs. Henderson says pharmacists make good money, so I could take care of you when you're old." Jake stopped walking and pulled Tommy into a hug that lasted longer than either of them expected. "You don't need to worry about taking care of me, buddy. That's my job. But someday I'll be big, and you'll be old like Grandpa Robert was. That's how families work." The mention of Robert Matthews hit Jake like cold water. Tommy had never met his grandfather. Robert had made sure of that, but children had a way of understanding family dynamics, even when adults tried to shield them from complicated truths. That evening, after Tommy had finished his homework and they'd shared a dinner of grilled cheese and tomato soup, Jake found himself staring at the deed to Sunset Gas Station. The legal language was straightforward enough. He owned the building, the underground storage tanks, the pumps, and 2.3 acres of land along Highway 9. What he didn't own was a clear path forward. His phone rang at 9:15, after Tommy had fallen asleep, clutching his elephant and dreaming whatever dreams belonged to 8-year-old boys who worried about their fathers more than they should. "Jake, it's Sarah." His ex-wife's voice carried the particular tone she used when she was about to deliver news he wouldn't want to hear. They'd managed to maintain a civil relationship for Tommy's sake, but conversations between them still felt like negotiations between countries with a complicated history. "Hey, Sarah, Tommy's already asleep if you want to call him tomorrow. Actually, I wanted to talk to you. I heard about your father's will." Jake rubbed his eyes, feeling the weight of the day settling into his bones. "Let me guess you think I should sell the gas station and find a stable job with benefits?" "I think you should consider what's best for Tommy. This town doesn't have anything to offer him, Jake. He's smart enough to get into good schools, but that takes money and stability. You think I don't know that?" Sarah's sigh traveled across the phone line like a small surrender. "I think you're a good father who's trying to do his best in a situation that would challenge anyone. But I also think you might be letting pride get in the way of practical decisions." After she hung up, Jake stood in his small kitchen and looked out the window toward the hills where Sunset Gas Station sat like a question mark against the horizon. Everyone had advice about what he should do with his inheritance, but nobody seemed to understand that this might be the first real chance he'd had to build something for Tommy's future. Maybe Frank was right. Maybe he should take a look at the place before listening to everyone else's opinions about what constituted a reasonable choice for a man in his position. The next morning, Jake called Frank and asked if he could borrow the shop's pickup truck for a few hours. The drive to Sunset Gas Station took Jake and Tommy through countryside that had once been prosperous farmland, but now showed the quiet decay of rural America. Abandoned barns leaned against the sky like broken prayers, their weathered wood telling stories of families who'd given up and moved to cities where work still existed. Tommy pressed his face against the passenger window of Frank's pickup truck, watching the landscape roll by with the fascination of a child who rarely traveled beyond the borders of Millbrook. "Is that it, Dad?" Tommy pointed ahead to where a faded sign announced Sunset Gas in letters that had once been red but now resembled the color of dried blood. Jake felt his stomach tighten as the full scope of his inheritance came into view. The gas station looked worse than he'd imagined, worse than anyone had bothered to describe. 2 of the 4 gas pumps had been knocked over, probably by teenagers with nothing better to do on Saturday nights. The canopy that should have protected customers from the weather had partially collapsed, its metal frame twisted like arthritic fingers. Windows in the main building were either boarded up or held together with duct tape, and the entire structure seemed to lean slightly to the left, as if it were tired of standing upright. "It looks sad," Tommy observed with the brutal honesty that children wielded like surgical instruments. Jake parked the truck and sat for a moment, wrestling with the urge to turn around and drive back to town. This wasn't just a fixer-upper, this was a demolition project, masquerading as real estate. The smart thing, the practical thing, would be to call a bulldozer company and clear the lot for sale. But something in his chest something that felt suspiciously like hope, whispered that he should at least look inside before admitting defeat. The key Mr. Henderson had given him fit the front door, though it took several minutes of jiggling and cursing before the lock finally surrendered. The door opened with a groan that sounded like it was in pain, and Jake stepped into what had once been the customer area of a functioning gas station. Sunlight filtered through dirty windows, illuminating a scene that belonged in a museum of American commerce. The cash register was ancient, probably installed sometime during the Carter administration. Shelves that should have held snacks and motor oil stood empty, except for dust and the occasional spider web. The linoleum floor was cracked and stained, telling wordless stories of coffee spills and muddy boots from decades of travelers who'd stopped for gas and moved on with their lives. "Wow," Tommy whispered, his voice echoing in the empty space. "It's like a time machine." Jake walked behind the counter and tried the cash register. To his surprise, it opened with a cheerful ding, revealing an empty drawer and a receipt dated September 15, 1994. Someone had written, "Gone fishing back Monday," on the back of the receipt in faded blue ink. Monday had apparently never come. The office door was locked, but Jake found another key on the ring Mr. Henderson had provided. Inside, he discovered what looked like the nerve center of a small business that had simply stopped functioning one day. A desk calendar showed April 1995. Coffee cups held pens that had long since run dry. Filing cabinets lined one wall, their metal drawers labeled with categories like suppliers, taxes, and customers. "Dad, look at this," Tommy called from across the room. He was standing in front of a bulletin board, covered with photographs, receipts, and handwritten notes. The centerpiece was a faded color photo showing a younger version of Robert Matthews standing next to a gleaming gas station that bore no resemblance to the ruin they'd just entered. Jake approached the bulletin board with the caution of a man approaching a sleeping snake. His father looked happy in the photograph, genuinely happy in a way Jake couldn't remember ever seeing. Robert had his arm around a woman Jake didn't recognize, and both of them were grinning at the camera like they'd just won the lottery. "Is that Grandpa Robert?" Tommy asked. "Yeah, buddy, that's him." Jake studied the other items on the bulletin board. Receipts from suppliers, thank you notes from customers, a newspaper clipping announcing the grand opening of Sunset Gas Station in 1987. There was even a photo of a ribbon-cutting ceremony, with Robert Matthews holding oversized scissors, while a small crowd applauded. "He looked nice," Tommy said, with the generous spirit of a child who'd never been disappointed by a grandfather's absence. Jake was about to respond when Tommy wandered over to the desk and began exploring the drawers with the fearless curiosity of youth. Most of them were locked, but the bottom drawer on the right side opened with a rusty squeal. "Dad, there's stuff in here," Tommy announced, pulling out a small wooden box that had been hidden beneath a stack of old road maps. The box was simple but well made, the kind of craftsmanship that suggested it had been built to last. Inside, Jake found a collection of items that felt like artifacts from an archaeological dig, a pocket watch that had stopped at 3:17, a silver dollar from 1964, a photograph of Jake as a young boy sitting on someone's shoulders, and a set of keys on a ring that was newer than everything else in the office. Jake's hands trembled as he picked up the photograph. He couldn't have been more than 5 years old, and he was laughing at something outside the frame. The person carrying him was clearly his father, though only Robert's hands and forearms were visible in the shot. On the back, someone had written, "Jake's first fishing trip. He caught 3 bluegill and wanted to throw them all back. You were cute, Dad," Tommy said, peering over Jake's shoulder. The memory came flooding back. A warm Saturday morning, the smell of coffee and bacon from the camp stove, his father's patient voice explaining how to bait a hook without hurting the worm. Jake had indeed wanted to throw the fish back because he felt sorry for them, and Robert had let him, saying that sometimes the best part of fishing was just being by the water. That had been less than 2 years before Robert left. Jake pocketed the photograph and examined the keys. Unlike the other items in the box, these looked recently made. One was clearly for a house or building, brass and substantial. The others were smaller, the kind used for filing cabinets, safe deposit boxes, or storage units. A paper tag attached to the ring bore a single word in Robert's handwriting: Jake. "I think these were meant for you," Tommy observed, with the matter-of-fact wisdom of childhood. Before Jake could respond, they heard voices outside, young voices, probably teenagers, talking and laughing with the particular brand of bravado that came from believing the world belonged to you and consequences were for other people. "Someone's out there," Jake said, moving to the window. Through the dirty glass, he could see 3 teenagers, maybe 16 or 17 years old, walking around the gas pumps with the casual ownership of vandals surveying their territory. One of them carried a baseball bat. "Hey, old man," one of the kids shouted when he spotted Jake in the window. "This place is condemned. You're not supposed to be here." Jake opened the front door, keeping Tommy behind him. "I own this place. You kids need to move along." The teenager with the baseball bat stepped forward, his swagger amplified by the presence of his friends. "Nobody owns this dump. It's been empty for years. We come here all the time." "Well, you won't be coming here anymore," Jake said, trying to project more authority than he felt. "This is private property, and I'm asking you to leave." "Or what?" The kid was maybe 17, all elbows and attitude, the kind of young man who'd spent his entire life being told he was special and had developed an allergy to anyone who suggested otherwise. "You gonna call the cops? Sheriff Martinez won't do nothing about some kids having fun at an abandoned gas station." Jake felt Tommy press against his back, small hands gripping his shirt. The last thing he wanted was a confrontation, but something about the kid's tone, the casual dismissal of Jake's ownership, the implied threat in the way he held the baseball bat, it all combined to wake up something in Jake that had been sleeping for years. "I'm not going to call anyone," Jake said, his voice dropping into a register he hadn't used since high school. "I'm going to ask you one more time to get off my property. After that, we're going to have a different kind of conversation." The teenagers looked at each other, suddenly less certain about the entertainment value of hassling a man and his kid. Jake wasn't particularly large or intimidating, but there was something in his posture, in the way he positioned himself between them and Tommy, that suggested he wasn't going to back down. "Come on," one of the other kids said. "This place is boring anyway." They left, but not before the kid with the bat took one last swing at a road sign, sending it spinning with a metallic clang that echoed across the empty lot. Jake waited until their car disappeared down Highway 9 before he allowed himself to breathe normally again. Tommy emerged from behind him, eyes wide with admiration. "That was awesome, Dad. You made them leave without even fighting." "Fighting should always be the last choice, buddy. But sometimes you have to stand your ground." They spent the next hour exploring the rest of the property. The garage area behind the main building was in better shape than Jake had expected, with enough space for several cars and a lift system that might still work with some attention. The underground storage tanks would need professional inspection, but the concrete pads seemed solid. It was Tommy who found the loose board in the office wall behind the filing cabinet that Jake had tried unsuccessfully to move. The board came away easily once Tommy pointed out that it didn't quite match the others, revealing a space that had clearly been used as a hiding place. Inside, Jake found a manila envelope containing documents that made him sit down hard in Robert's old desk chair. Oil and gas lease agreements from 1987, geological survey reports, letters from something called Meridian Oil Company, and at the bottom of the stack, a handwritten note in his father's familiar script. "The real treasure isn't the station, it's what's underneath. I should have fought harder for what was ours. Maybe you'll be stronger than I was. Dad." Jake stared at the note until the words blurred. Tommy climbed into his lap, sensing that something important was happening, even if he didn't understand what. "What does it mean, Dad?" Jake looked at the geological survey, the technical language, and numbered diagrams swimming before his eyes. He didn't understand most of it, but certain phrases jumped out: significant hydrocarbon deposits, estimated reserves, commercial viability. "I think it means your grandfather left us more than just a gas station, buddy." The drive back to town was quiet, both of them lost in thought. Jake's mind raced with possibilities and questions. How much were the mineral rights worth? Why had Robert hidden these documents? And most importantly, what was Jake supposed to do with information that could change everything about their lives? That evening, after Tommy had fallen asleep, Jake called the one person he knew who might be able to help him make sense of what they'd found. Elena Rodriguez had been the town librarian for 15 years before retiring to run Millbrook's tiny historical society. If anyone could help him research the history of Sunset Gas Station and the documents they'd discovered, it would be Elena. "Jake Matthews," she said when she answered the phone, her voice warm with the particular pleasure of someone who enjoyed solving puzzles. "I heard you inherited Robert's old place. How are you holding up?" "Actually, Elena, I was hoping you might be able to help me with some research. I found some old papers at the station, and I'm not sure what they mean." "Fithus, business documents? Personal papers?" Jake looked at the envelope, sitting on his kitchen table, filled with secrets that his father had kept hidden for nearly 30 years. "I'm not really sure what they are, but I think they might be important." Elena was quiet for a moment, and Jake could almost hear her mind working. "Why don't you bring them by tomorrow afternoon? I've got some research databases that might be helpful. And Jake, whatever you found, be careful who else you talk to about it. Small towns have long memories, and sometimes old business has ways of becoming new problems." After he hung up, Jake sat in his small kitchen and tried to process the events of the day. This morning, he'd been a single father with 3 jobs and no prospects. Now he was the owner of a ruined gas station that might be sitting on top of something valuable enough to hide for 3 decades. The rusty keys from his father's box sat on the table next to the envelope, and Jake had the unsettling feeling that he'd just opened a door he might not be able to close again. Jake arrived at Elena Rodriguez's house the next afternoon, carrying the manila envelope like it contained state secrets. Elena lived in one of Millbrook's better neighborhoods, where the houses had been built in the 1920s by families who believed the town had a prosperous future ahead of it. Her Victorian was painted sage green with white trim, surrounded by flower beds that showed the careful attention of someone who found peace in growing things. Come in," Elena said, ushering Jake through a front door adorned with stained glass panels that caught the afternoon light like jewels. "I've got coffee brewing, and I cleared off the dining room table so we can spread everything out." Elena Rodriguez was 62 years old. With silver hair she wore in a neat bun and the kind of sharp intelligence that had made her the go-to person in Millbrook for settling disputes about local history. She'd moved to town in 1985 to take the librarian position, bringing with her a master's degree in American history and an unshakable belief that every community deserved to understand its own story. The dining room was lined with bookshelves, and Jake recognized the particular organized chaos that belonged to people who treated research like archaeology. Stacks of papers covered every surface, each pile held down by coffee mugs that had been repurposed as paperweights. "So," Elena said, settling into a chair with the anticipation of someone about to unwrap a particularly interesting gift, "show me what your father left you." Jake spread the documents across the table, watching Elena's expression change as she examined each piece. Her historian's eye immediately went to the dates and signatures, looking for the threads that would weave these papers into a coherent story. 1987, she murmured, picking up one of the geological surveys. That was an interesting year for this part of the state. The oil industry was going through some changes, and there were several companies doing exploratory work in the region. She pulled a magnifying glass from a drawer and bent over the survey maps, tracing the property boundaries with her finger. "Jake, do you understand what these documents are telling you?" "Honestly, not really. I know they're related to oil and gas, but the technical language might as well be in another language." Elena sat back in her chair, her expression serious. "According to this geological survey, the area beneath your father's gas station contains what they call commercially viable hydrocarbon deposits. In plain English, there's oil down there, potentially a lot of it." Jake felt his mouth go dry. "How much is a lot? That's the question, isn't it?" Elena picked up the lease agreements, studying the fine print with the patience of someone who'd spent decades deciphering legal documents. "These papers suggest that Meridian Oil Company was very interested in your father's property back in 1987. They conducted extensive surveys and even negotiated preliminary agreements for extraction rights. But nothing happened. The gas station just closed. So, that's what makes this interesting." Elena moved to her computer, her fingers flying over the keyboard with surprising speed. "Let me see what I can find about Meridian Oil Company." While Elena worked, Jake wandered around the dining room, looking at the framed photographs that chronicled Millbrook's history. Pictures of the town's main street from the 1950s, when every storefront was occupied and the sidewalks bustled with shoppers. Images of the textile mill in its heyday, with workers streaming through the gates at shift change. An aerial photograph from the 1980s that showed the town before the economic decline, when hope was still a reasonable investment. "Interesting," Elena said from her computer. Meridian Oil Company was involved in several controversial deals in the late 1980s. There are newspaper articles here about disputed mineral rights, legal battles with landowners, and at least one federal investigation into their business practices. Jake returned to the table. "What kind of business practices?" "The kind that involved convincing landowners to sign away their mineral rights for far less than they were worth. Sometimes through pressure, sometimes through outright deception." Elena's expression had grown troubled. "Jake, I think your father might have been smarter than Meridian gave him credit for." She pulled out a legal document that Jake had barely glanced at, pointing to a section of dense text near the bottom. "Look at this clause. Your father retained all subsurface mineral rights to the property. He sold Meridian the right to explore and survey, but he never signed away ownership of whatever they might find." Jake stared at the document, trying to process what Elena was telling him. "So if there's oil under the gas station, it belongs to you." Elena's voice carried the weight of someone delivering news that was both wonderful and potentially dangerous. "The question is whether Meridian Oil Company agrees with that interpretation." They spent the next 2 hours researching everything they could find about the oil industry in their region during the 1980s. Elena's historical databases revealed a pattern of aggressive land acquisition by several companies, including Meridian. There were stories of family farms lost to legal battles, of mineral rights sold under pressure, of small-town lawyers who'd been outmaneuvered by corporate legal teams. "Your father was a mechanic, not a lawyer," Elena observed as they reviewed a particularly complex contract dispute from 1988. "But somehow he managed to structure a deal that protected his interests. That suggests he had help, good help." As the afternoon wore on, Jake found himself thinking about the man who'd walked out of his life when he was 12 years old. The Robert Matthews he remembered had been angry, restless, prone to disappearing for days at a time and returning with elaborate excuses about work opportunities that never materialized. But these documents painted a picture of someone who'd been methodical, careful, strategic in his business dealings. "Elena," Jake said finally, "why would my father hide all this? If he'd discovered oil on his property, why not develop it? Why let the gas station fall apart?" Elena was quiet for a long moment, the kind of silence that suggested she was choosing her words carefully. "I don't know, Jake. but I've lived in small towns long enough to understand that sometimes people hide things because they're scared, and sometimes they're right to be scared. As Jake prepared to leave, Elena walked him to the front door with the deliberate pace of someone who had something important to say. "Jake, I want you to promise me something. Don't talk to anyone else about these documents until we know more. And if anyone approaches you about buying the gas station, don't make any quick decisions. Sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones who seem most eager to help." The drive home gave Jake time to think about Elena's warning, but his thoughts were interrupted by the sight of a black sedan parked in front of his apartment building. Two men in business suits stood beside the car, their presence as out of place in Jake's neighborhood as a yacht in a cornfield. Jake parked Frank's truck and approached the men with the caution of someone who'd learned that unexpected visitors rarely brought good news. "Mr. Matthews?" The older of the two men stepped forward, extending his hand with the practiced smile of a professional salesman. "My name is Marcus Webb. I represent Meridian Oil Company. I understand you've recently inherited some property that might be of interest to us." Jake didn't take the offered hand. "How did you know about my inheritance?" "Property transfers are public record, Mr. Matthews. We make it our business to stay informed about developments in areas where we have historical interests." Webb's smile never wavered, but his eyes were cold and calculating. "I was hoping we could have a conversation about your father's gas station." "What kind of conversation?" "The kind that could be very profitable for you and your son. We're prepared to make you a generous offer for the property, generous enough that you wouldn't have to worry about money for a very long time." Jake felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. These men had done their homework. They knew about Tommy, knew about Jake's financial situation, knew exactly which buttons to push to make their offer sound appealing. "I'm not interested in selling," Jake said. Webb's smile finally faded. "Mr. Matthews, I don't think you understand the situation. That property has been abandoned for years. The building is structurally unsound, the underground tanks are probably leaking, and the cost of bringing everything up to code would be astronomical. We're offering you a way out of what could become a very expensive problem. And if I'm not interested in your way out..." The second man, who'd remained silent until now, stepped closer. He was younger than Webb, built like someone who'd spent time in a gym with serious intentions. "Sometimes people think they want to restore old properties," he said in a voice that carried the subtle menace of a threat wrapped in reasonable words. "But they don't realize how many things can go wrong. Accidents happen, permits get delayed, inspectors find problems that weren't there before." Jake felt anger rising in his chest, the same anger that had helped him face down the teenagers at the gas station. "Are you threatening me?" Webb raised his hands in a gesture of mock surrender. "Of course not, Mr. Matthews. We're businessmen, not thugs. We're simply trying to save you from making a mistake that could hurt your family's future. My family's future is my concern, not yours." Webb reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card, placing it on the hood of Frank's truck. "Think about our offer, Mr. Matthews. Call me when you're ready to be reasonable. But don't wait too long. Opportunities like this have a way of disappearing." The two men climbed into their sedan and drove away, leaving Jake standing alone on the sidewalk with questions multiplying in his mind like bacteria in a petri dish. How had they found him so quickly? How much did they know about the documents he'd discovered? And most importantly, what were they prepared to do if he continued to refuse their offer? That evening, after Tommy had finished his homework and they'd shared another dinner of soup and sandwiches, Jake found himself staring at Marcus Webb's business card. The company logo was elegant, expensive-looking, the kind of design that suggested serious money and serious influence. He thought about Elena's warning, about his father's hidden documents, about the teenagers who'd claimed they came to the gas station all the time. For the first time, Jake wondered if the vandalism at Sunset gas station had been random teenage mischief or something more purposeful. Before going to bed, Jake walked through their small apartment and checked all the locks twice. He also moved the manila envelope from the kitchen table to a hiding place behind Tommy's dresser, wrapped in one of his old work shirts. It wasn't much of a security system, but it made him feel slightly better about the invisible target that seemed to have appeared on their backs. Tommy was already asleep, clutching his stuffed elephant and dreaming whatever dreams belonged to 8-year-old boys who didn't yet understand that their lives had just become much more complicated. Jake stood in the doorway of his son's room and made a silent promise that whatever happened with the gas station, whatever dangers might be lurking in his father's legacy, he would protect Tommy from the consequences of choices that had been made before the boy was even born. But as he lay in bed, listening to the familiar sounds of his neighborhood settling into sleep, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that protection might require more than good intentions and double-locked doors. Jake couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Marcus Webb's calculating smile and heard the subtle threat in his companion's voice. At 2:17 a.m., he gave up on rest and padded to the kitchen, where he made coffee and sat at the table, staring at the business card that seemed to pulse with malevolent energy in the dim light. The rusty keys from his father's wooden box lay beside the card, and Jake found himself turning them over in his hands like worry stones. One was clearly meant for a door or building. The others were smaller, more specialized. But it was the paper tag with his name that haunted him, evidence that his father had planned for this moment, had known that someday Jake would need these keys to unlock secrets that Robert Matthews had carried to his grave. By morning, Jake had made a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. He was going back to the gas station, and this time he was going to use those keys to find whatever his father had hidden. Frank Morrison accepted Jake's request for another day off with the gruff understanding of someone who'd spent his life navigating the complications of small-town relationships. "Take the truck," he said, tossing Jake the keys without looking up from the carburetor he was rebuilding. "And Jake, be careful. Men in expensive suits don't usually show up in Millbrook unless they want something badly enough to fight for it." Tommy was unusually quiet during the drive to Sunset Gas Station, picking at the strap of his backpack with the nervous energy of a child who sensed that adult concerns had invaded his previously secure world. "Are we in trouble, Dad?" he asked as they pulled into the cracked parking lot. Jake turned off the engine and considered how to answer. Tommy deserved honesty, but there was a difference between honesty and burdening an 8-year-old with fears that might prove groundless. "I don't know yet, buddy, but whatever happens, we're going to face it together, okay?" Tommy nodded with the serious expression he wore when trying to be brave for his father's sake. The gas station looked even more desolate in the morning light, shadows emphasizing every crack in the concrete and every piece of missing siding. But Jake approached the building with new purpose, the rusty keys warm in his palm and his father's cryptic note echoing in his memory. "The real treasure isn't the station, it's what's underneath." Inside the office, Jake began a systematic search for anything the keys might unlock. The filing cabinets were the obvious choice, but the small keys were too specialized for standard office furniture. He tried the desk drawers, the supply closet, even an old toolbox he found beneath a pile of yellowed newspapers, but nothing fit. It was Tommy who suggested they look for hidden compartments, approaching the search with the natural curiosity of a child who'd grown up reading adventure stories about pirates and buried treasure. "In books, people always hide important stuff behind fake walls or under floorboards," Tommy said, running his hands along the office walls with the methodical patience of a young detective. Jake was about to dismiss the idea as childish fantasy when Tommy's exploration revealed something that made them both stop breathing. Behind Robert Matthews' desk, partially concealed by decades of dust and neglect, was a small metal plate set into the wall at knee height. The plate was roughly the size of a paperback book, with a keyhole that perfectly matched one of the smaller keys from the wooden box. Jake's hands trembled as he inserted the key and turned it. The plate swung open on hidden hinges, revealing a cavity that contained a metal safety deposit box and an envelope marked "Urgent Read First." The envelope contained a single sheet of paper covered with his father's handwriting, but the words were so different from anything Jake remembered about Robert Matthews that he read them twice before accepting their reality. Jake, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and you've inherited a problem I couldn't solve. The oil under our property is real, worth more than either of us could spend in 10 lifetimes. But Meridian Oil Company killed for it once, and they'll kill for it again. They murdered Walter Henning in 1988 when he tried to expose their fraudulent contracts. They made it look like an accident, but Walter had been asking too many questions about their business practices. I have proof, but I wasn't brave enough to use it. Maybe you'll be stronger than I was. The safety deposit box contains everything you need to know. Bank of Millbrook, box 247. The key is in the wooden box. Trust Elena Rodriguez. She helped me research the legal documents. Don't trust anyone else until you know who's working for Meridian. I'm sorry I left you and your mother. I thought distance would keep you safe. I was wrong about many things, but I wasn't wrong about loving you both. Robert Matthews. Jake sank into his father's desk chair, the letter shaking in his hands. Tommy climbed onto his lap, sensing that something monumental had just shifted in their understanding of the world. "Dad, you're crying," Tommy observed with the gentle concern of a child comforting a parent. Jake wiped his eyes and pulled Tommy closer. Sometimes grown-ups cry when they learn things that change everything they thought they knew, like finding out Grandpa Robert didn't really abandon us. The wisdom in Tommy's voice made Jake's chest ache. "Yeah, buddy, exactly like that." They spent the rest of the morning exploring the gas station with new eyes, looking for any other secrets Robert Matthews might have hidden. In the garage area, they found evidence of recent activity, fresh footprints in the dust, cigarette butts that hadn't been there during their first visit, scratches around the locks that suggested someone had been testing various keys. "Someone else has been here," Jake said, photographing the evidence with his phone. "The teenagers from yesterday." Jake studied the footprints more carefully. They were too large and too organized to belong to vandalistic teenagers. These were the marks of adults conducting a methodical search, people who knew what they were looking for and had the patience to be thorough. The realization that Meridian Oil Company might have been searching the property for years sent a chill through Jake's body. How long had they been watching the gas station? How long had they known about Robert's hidden documents? And most importantly, how far were they prepared to go to claim what they believed belonged to them? That afternoon, Jake and Tommy drove to the Bank of Millbrook, a sturdy brick building that had been serving the community since 1923. The bank president, Mrs. Catherine Walsh, had known Jake since he was Tommy's age, and she greeted them with the warm efficiency of someone who treated every customer like family. "Jake Matthews, I heard about your father's passing. I'm so sorry for your loss." "Thank you, Mrs. Walsh. I need to access a safety deposit box that belonged to him. I have the key and proper documentation." Mrs. Walsh led them through the security procedures with practiced ease, but Jake noticed her expression grow concerned as she reviewed Robert's records. "Jake, your father was very specific about the terms of access to this box. Only you or Elena Rodriguez were authorized to open it, and only after his death. He was quite insistent about those restrictions." "Elena Rodriguez, the librarian?" "Former librarian, yes. Your father updated these instructions just 6 months ago. He said Elena was helping him with some research project." Box 247 was larger than Jake had expected, big enough to hold several thick folders and a manila envelope marked evidence. The contents were extensive enough that Mrs. Walsh provided them with a private viewing room and assured them they could take as much time as they needed. What Jake found in the box exceeded his worst fears and highest hopes simultaneously. The folders contained copies of every document related to Meridian Oil Company's activities in the region, dating back to 1987. But these weren't just business records, they were evidence of systematic fraud, including forged signatures on mineral rights transfers, bribes paid to local officials, and most damning of all, a recorded conversation between two Meridian executives discussing the death of Walter Henning. Walter was getting too close to the truth, one voice said on the tape. The brake line failure was unfortunate but necessary. We can't let one stubborn landowner destroy a $200 million opportunity. What about the Matthews property? Robert's been asking questions too. We'll handle Robert differently. He has a family. Sometimes the threat is more effective than the action. Jake's hands shook as he turned off the tape player. His father hadn't abandoned the family. He'd been driven away by men who'd murdered for less than what lay beneath Sunset gas station. The evidence envelope contained photographs, financial records, and legal documents that painted a picture of corporate corruption spanning decades. Meridian Oil Company hadn't just cheated landowners, they'd committed fraud on a scale that would interest federal prosecutors and possibly the FBI. But the most shocking discovery was a handwritten letter addressed to Jake, dated only 3 months before Robert's death. Son, I know you think I abandoned you, and I've carried that guilt every day for 26 years. The truth is that I left to protect you and your mother from people who would have used you as leverage against me. Meridian made it clear that my cooperation was required, and my family's safety was negotiable. I thought if I disappeared, they'd leave you alone and focus on easier targets. I was naive about many things, but I wasn't naive about their capacity for violence. Now I'm dying, and I realize my silence protected no one. These men took Walter Henning's life, destroyed dozens of families, and stolen millions of dollars from people who trusted them. I can't undo the damage, but maybe you can find the courage I never had. The evidence in this box could put them in prison for the rest of their lives, but using it will put you in danger. I'm sorry to burden you with this choice, but you're the only family I have left, and this secret is too big to die with me. Whatever you decide, know that leaving you was the hardest thing I ever did, and not a day has passed that I haven't wished I'd found another way. Your father, Robert Matthews. Jake closed the letter and looked at Tommy, who was quietly drawing pictures on the back of bank deposit slips, unaware that their lives had just been redefined by the weight of secrets and the promise of justice delayed but not denied. Outside the bank, Jake called Elena Rodriguez from his cell phone, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he'd discovered. Elena, I found my father's safety deposit box. We need to talk tonight if possible. And Elena, you were right to tell me to be careful. This is bigger than either of us imagined. Elena's response was immediate and decisive. Come to my house after dinner, use the back entrance, and make sure you're not followed. Jake, if your father left what I think he left, we're going to need help from people with more authority than a retired librarian and a single father. As Jake and Tommy drove home through the familiar streets of Millbrook, Jake found himself seeing everything differently. The black sedan that had been parked across from their apartment building the night before, was it coincidence or surveillance? The new face behind the counter at Peterson's pharmacy, was he a temporary employee or someone keeping track of Jake's movements? For the first time in his adult life, Jake understood what it felt like to carry secrets that were powerful enough to change lives and dangerous enough to end them. Elena Rodriguez answered her back door before Jake could knock, pulling him and Tommy inside with the urgent efficiency of someone who understood that their conversation required privacy. She'd drawn all the curtains in her dining room and set up what looked like a war room. Maps spread across the table, legal documents organized into neat stacks, and a laptop computer displaying what appeared to be corporate financial records. I've been busy since your call, Elena said, pouring coffee for Jake and setting out juice and crackers for Tommy. After your father died, I continued researching Meridian Oil Company. What I found confirms your father's worst fears. She handed Jake a folder labeled Meridian Investigations and waited while he absorbed the contents. Newspaper clippings from across the region told the story of a company that had specialized in acquiring mineral rights through methods that ranged from legally questionable to outright criminal. Several landowners had died in accidents after refusing to sell. Others had been bankrupted by legal challenges that stretched on for years. Pattern after pattern of people who'd stood in Meridian's way and suffered consequences. Walter Henning wasn't the only one, Elena said quietly, glancing at Tommy to make sure he was occupied with his coloring book. There were at least 6 suspicious deaths between 1987 and 1995, all involving people who owned property with potential oil reserves. Jake felt sick. And nobody investigated? Small-town police departments don't have the resources to investigate complex financial crimes. State authorities assumed these were isolated incidents. The FBI was never called in because no one connected the dots. Elena's expression was grim. Your father was the only person who kept track of the pattern, and he was too scared to come forward. But he saved the evidence. Everything we need to build a case. Financial records showing bribes to local officials. Recorded conversations proving conspiracy, legal documents demonstrating systematic fraud. Elena paused, choosing her words carefully. The question is whether we're prepared for what happens when we use this evidence. Jake thought about Marcus Webb's cold smile and the implied threats from his companion. What kind of consequences are we talking about? The kind that end careers, destroy companies, and send people to federal prison for the rest of their lives. Meridian Oil Company has hundreds of millions of dollars at stake. They've killed to protect smaller secrets than this. Tommy looked up from his coloring book, sensing the tension in the adult conversation. Are we talking about the bad men who wanted to buy the gas station? Elena's expression softened as she looked at Jake's son. We're talking about making sure bad men can't hurt good people anymore, sweetie. Sometimes grown-ups have to make difficult choices to protect their families and their community. Jake studied the evidence spread across Elena's dining room table. Bank records showing suspicious payments to local officials. Photographs of documents that had been reported as lost or destroyed. Audio recordings that captured corporate executives discussing murder with the casual indifference of people ordering lunch. The weight of his father's sacrifice, 26 years of exile from his family, pressed down on Jake like a physical force. Elena, I need you to help me understand something. If this evidence is so damaging, why didn't my father use it? Why live with the guilt of abandoning his family if he had the power to destroy the people who threatened us? Elena was quiet for a long moment, her historian's mind weighing the complexities of human motivation. I think your father was caught between impossible choices. Using the evidence would have exposed Meridian, but it also would have made him and your family permanent targets. These people don't just give up when they lose, they retaliate. So he chose to disappear instead. He chose to sacrifice his own happiness to keep you and your mother safe. It may not have been the choice you wanted him to make, but it was the choice of a man who loved his family more than his own comfort. Jake felt tears burning behind his eyes as he processed the magnitude of his father's sacrifice. Robert Matthews hadn't been a coward or a deadbeat. He'd been a man trying to protect his family from people who had proven their willingness to commit murder for money. What do you think I should do? Elena reached across the table and covered Jake's hand with her own. I think you should talk to someone with the authority to act on this evidence. I have a contact at the FBI field office in Pittsburgh, Agent Patricia Coleman. She specializes in corporate fraud cases, and she's built a reputation for taking on companies that think they're too powerful to prosecute. Will she believe us? She'll believe the evidence. And Jake, there's something else you need to know. Elena's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. I think Meridian has been watching you since your father's funeral. The same black sedan has driven past your apartment building every evening for the past week. Yesterday, a man in a business suit was asking questions about you at Peterson's pharmacy. Jake's blood turned cold. Tommy, buddy, can you go play in Elena's living room for a few minutes? The grown-ups need to talk about some boring stuff. After Tommy had settled himself in front of Elena's television with a stack of books, Jake leaned forward urgently. What kind of questions? Your work schedule, Tommy's school routine, whether you had any family outside of Millbrook. Elena's expression was troubled. Jake, I think they're gathering intelligence for something more than a simple business negotiation. The implications hit Jake like a physical blow. Meridian wasn't just monitoring him, they were mapping out his vulnerabilities, learning everything they needed to know to apply maximum pressure, or worse. I have to get Tommy somewhere safe. I agree. Do you have family outside the area? Jake thought about his limited options. His mother had died 5 years ago. His ex-wife Sarah lived 2 hours away, but their relationship was complicated enough without adding corporate conspiracy theories to the mix. There was his cousin David in Philadelphia, but they hadn't spoken in years. Not really. Nobody who would understand why I'm suddenly paranoid about men in business suits. Elena stood up and walked to her kitchen, returning with a business card that looked like it had been handled frequently. Agent Coleman gave me this card 3 years ago when I was researching some irregularities in local property transfers. She said to call if I ever found evidence of systematic fraud in the region. Jake studied the card. FBI Special Agent Patricia Coleman, Corporate Crime Division. The name carried weight, the kind of authority that might be able to protect his family while they pursued justice for his father's murder. Elena, if I call this agent, there's no going back. Once the FBI gets involved, everyone in Millbrook will know about the investigation. My life, Tommy's life, everything changes. And if you don't call her, Meridian Oil Company continues to get away with murder. More families get destroyed. More good people suffer while criminals profit from their crimes. Elena's voice carried the moral clarity of someone who'd spent her career documenting the difference between right and wrong. Your father spent 26 years living with the consequences of not acting. Do you want to spend the next 26 years wondering what would have happened if you'd found the courage he couldn't? Jake looked through the doorway at Tommy, who was reading one of Elena's history books with the focused concentration he applied to everything that captured his interest. His son deserved to grow up in a world where justice existed, where powerful people couldn't destroy families and walk away unpunished. If I do this, if I call Agent Coleman and turn over the evidence, can you help me keep Tommy safe while the investigation moves forward? I have a sister in Vermont who runs a small bed and breakfast. She's discreet, reliable, and far enough away from Millbrook that Tommy would be completely off Meridian's radar. He could stay there while you work with the FBI. The thought of separating from Tommy, even temporarily, made Jake's chest ache. But the alternative, keeping his son close while dangerous people escalated, their pressure was worse. How do I explain to an 8-year-old that his father is about to become the target of people who've committed murder to protect their business interests? Elena's expression softened with grandmother's wisdom. You tell him the truth, adjusted for his age. You tell him that his grandfather was a hero who tried to stop bad people from hurting others, and now it's his father's turn to finish what his grandfather started. Children understand justice better than adults. Sometimes they haven't learned yet to accept that the world is unfair. That evening, after they'd returned home and Tommy had fallen asleep, Jake sat at his kitchen table with Agent Coleman's business card and his father's evidence spread before him. The recorded conversation with Meridian executives discussing Walter Henning's murder played softly in the background, Robert's final gift to the son he'd protected through absence and sacrifice. Jake picked up his phone and dialed the number on Agent Coleman's card. It rang twice before a professional voice answered. Agent Coleman, FBI Corporate Crime Division. Agent Coleman, my name is Jake Matthews. I'm calling from Millbrook, Pennsylvania. I have evidence of a conspiracy involving murder, fraud, and corporate corruption that I think you'll want to see. There was a brief pause before Agent Coleman responded, and when she spoke, her voice carried the focused intensity of a hunter who just caught the scent of prey. Mr. Matthews, I'm going to need you to tell me everything, starting from the beginning. And Mr. Matthews, Don't discuss this conversation with anyone until we meet. If what you're suggesting is true, you may be in more danger than you realize. Agent Patricia Coleman arrived in Millbrook 3 days later, driving an unmarked sedan and wearing the kind of conservative business attire that allowed her to blend into any professional environment. She was younger than Jake had expected, probably in her early 40s, with sharp eyes that missed nothing, and the confident bearing of someone who'd built her career by taking down people who thought they were untouchable. The meeting took place in Elena's dining room, the same space where Jake had first learned the scope of his father's secret war against Meridian Oil Company. Agent Coleman examined each piece of evidence with methodical precision, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but mostly listening with the focused intensity of a professional investigator. "Mr. Matthews," she said finally, closing the last folder of financial records, "your father assembled what may be the most comprehensive case against corporate corruption I've seen in 15 years of federal law enforcement. This evidence could result in dozens of felony convictions and hundreds of millions of dollars in penalties." Jake felt a surge of pride in the man he'd spent most of his adult life resenting. "So you'll take the case? I'm going to recommend that the Department of Justice open a full investigation, but I need you to understand what that means for you and your family." Agent Coleman's expression was serious. "Once we move forward, Meridian Oil Company will know they're under federal investigation. They'll also know you provided the evidence. These people have committed murder to protect smaller secrets than this. What kind of protection can you offer?" "We can put you in the witness protection program if necessary. New identities, relocation, complete separation from your current life." Agent Coleman paused, letting the implications settle. "But that's a last resort. First, we're going to try a different approach." She opened her briefcase and removed a small electronic device that looked like a cross between a cell phone and a radio. "This is a recording device. It's designed to capture high-quality audio while remaining completely undetectable. We want you to meet with Marcus Webb and get him to admit to the crimes your father documented." Jake stared at the device, understanding that Agent Coleman was asking him to voluntarily walk into a situation that could get him killed. "You want me to wear a wire? I want you to be our inside source. Meridian clearly wants your property badly enough to apply pressure. Let's give them the opportunity to incriminate themselves while we record every word." Elena leaned forward, her expression concerned. "Agent Coleman, you're asking Jake to put himself in extraordinary danger. These people have killed before. What's to stop them from killing again?" "Because they think they're in control of the situation. They believe Jake is just a struggling single father who can be intimidated or bought off. They don't know about the evidence, and they don't know we're investigating them." Agent Coleman's voice carried the confidence of someone who'd orchestrated successful stings before. "Jake has something they want desperately. That gives us leverage." Jake thought about Tommy, safely hidden away at Elena's sister's bed and breakfast in Vermont, believing his father was simply taking care of some complicated legal business. The boy had accepted the temporary separation with the trusting resilience of childhood, but Jake knew that if something went wrong, if Meridian discovered the truth before the FBI could act, Tommy might never see his father again. "What exactly would you want me to do?" "Call Marcus Webb. Tell him you've reconsidered his offer to buy the gas station. Arrange a meeting to discuss terms. While you're negotiating, get him to talk about why the property is so valuable to Meridian. Get him to admit they've been monitoring you, pressuring you, doing whatever they've been doing to try to force a sale. And if he suspects something?" Agent Coleman's expression was grim. "Then we extract you immediately and move to Plan B, witness protection, and a slower investigation that might take years to build a case." Jake picked up the recording device, surprised by how light it felt, considering the weight of responsibility it represented. "How long would this take? If everything goes according to plan, we could have enough evidence to make arrests within a week. If Webb takes the bait and starts talking about their history of intimidation and violence, we might be able to wrap up your father's case, along with current charges." Elena reached across the table and squeezed Jake's hand. "You don't have to do this, Jake. Your father chose to walk away rather than take this kind of risk. Nobody would blame you for making the same choice." Jake thought about the 26 years Robert Matthews had spent in exile, wondering if his son would ever forgive him for abandoning the family. He thought about Walter Henning and the other landowners who died because they'd stood in Meridian's way. He thought about Tommy, growing up in a world where powerful people could commit murder and walk away unpunished. "My father spent half his life running from these people. I'm not going to spend half of mine doing the same thing." Agent Coleman smiled for the first time since entering Elena's house. "Mr. Matthews, I think your father would be proud of the man you've become." That afternoon, Jake called Marcus Webb from Elena's landline, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. "Mr. Webb, this is Jake Matthews. I've been thinking about your offer for the gas station." Webb's response was immediate and pleased. "Mr. Matthews, I'm so glad you called. I was hoping you'd reconsider our proposition. I'm interested in hearing more details, but I want to meet somewhere private to discuss terms. I don't want the whole town knowing my business." Of course. Discretion is always preferable in these matters. What did you have in mind?" Jake glanced at Agent Coleman, who nodded encouragingly. "The gas station itself. Tomorrow evening, around 7 o'clock. Just you and me, no lawyers, no corporate representatives. If we can work out the basic terms, then we can involve other people." "That sounds perfect, Mr. Matthews. I appreciate your practical approach to business." After Jake hung up, Agent Coleman spent 2 hours briefing him on interrogation techniques, teaching him how to ask questions that would encourage Webb to reveal information about Meridian's illegal activities. "Remember, you're not trying to be subtle," Agent Coleman explained. "You're a small-town mechanic who's curious about why a big company wants his property so badly. Ask obvious questions. Let Webb think he's educating you about the oil business. What if he gets suspicious about my questions? Then you fall back on natural curiosity and financial anxiety. You're a single father who's never owned anything valuable. Of course, you'd want to understand why your property is worth so much money to them." As evening approached, Jake felt the familiar tightness in his chest that had plagued him since childhood, whenever he faced situations beyond his control. But underneath the anxiety was something else, a sense of purpose that he hadn't experienced since Tommy's birth. For the first time in his adult life, he was fighting for something larger than daily survival. Agent Coleman drove Jake to Sunset gas station in an unmarked vehicle, parking a quarter-mile away where her surveillance equipment could monitor the meeting without being detected. "Remember," she said as Jake prepared to walk to the gas station, "you're not trying to be a hero. You're gathering evidence. If Webb says anything threatening, if you feel like the situation is getting out of control, you give me the signal and we extract you immediately." Jake nodded, checking the recording device one final time. It was taped to his chest beneath his work shirt, invisible but reassuring in its presence. "Agent Coleman," Jake said as he opened the car door, "if something goes wrong tonight, make sure Tommy knows why I did this. Make sure he understands that his grandfather was a good man who tried to do the right thing, and his father was trying to finish what his grandfather started. Nothing's going to go wrong, Mr. Matthews. You're going to get the evidence we need. We're going to arrest the people responsible for your father's exile and Walter Henning's murder, and you're going to go home to your son with the knowledge that justice has finally been served." Jake walked through the evening twilight toward Sunset gas station, where Marcus Webb's black sedan was already waiting in the shadows beside the broken pumps. The recording device felt warm against his chest, and his father's voice echoed in his memory. "Maybe you'll be stronger than I was." Tonight, Jake intended to find out. Marcus Webb stepped out of his sedan as Jake approached Sunset gas station, but he wasn't alone. The younger man who'd accompanied him during their first encounter emerged from the passenger side, and Jake noticed a third figure waiting in the shadows beside the building, someone who looked more like muscle than a businessman. "Mr. Matthews," Webb called out with his practiced salesman's smile. "Thank you for agreeing to meet. I hope we can reach an understanding tonight that benefits everyone involved." Jake forced himself to maintain steady breathing as he walked toward the group, the recording device capturing every word, while Agent Coleman monitored from her hidden position. "I appreciate you coming out here, Mr. Webb. I figured it was time to be realistic about my situation. Realism is the foundation of good business, Mr. Matthews. Now, shall we go inside and discuss the details of our offer?" As they approached the gas station's front door, Jake noticed that the lock had been changed. Webb produced a key from his pocket, with the casual confidence of someone who'd prepared for this meeting in ways that had nothing to do with legitimate business negotiations. "I took the liberty of securing the property," Webb explained, noticing Jake's surprised expression. "We've had some concerns about vandalism and theft. I hope you don't mind." Jake felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. "How did you get a key to my property?" "Property law can be quite complex, Mr. Matthews. Sometimes ownership isn't as clear-cut as people assume." Webb's smile never wavered, but his eyes had gone cold. "Shall we go inside?" The interior of the gas station had been transformed since Jake's last visit. Someone had installed battery-powered lights, cleared away most of the debris, and set up what looked like a mobile command center with computers, filing cabinets, and communication equipment. This wasn't the setup for a simple business meeting. This was the headquarters of an operation. Impressive, isn't it? Webb gestured around the transformed space with obvious pride. "We've been using this facility as a regional coordination center for several months. Your father's property has proven quite useful for our purposes." Jake's mind raced as he processed the implications. "You've been operating out of my gas station without my permission." "Permission is a legal concept, Mr. Matthews, and as I mentioned, legal ownership of this property isn't as straightforward as you might believe." Webb settled into a chair behind one of the computer stations, transforming from visiting businessman to command center operator. "You see, your father may have thought he was cleverer than he actually was." The younger man, who'd remained silent until now, stepped closer to Jake with the casual menace of someone accustomed to intimidating people. "Mr. Matthews, we know about the safety deposit box. We know about the documents your father hid. We know about your meetings with Elena Rodriguez and your phone call to the FBI." Jake's blood turned to ice water. They knew everything, which meant Agent Coleman's carefully planned operation had been compromised before it began. "I don't know what you're talking about." Webb laughed, a sound devoid of any genuine humor. "Mr. Matthews, please don't insult our intelligence. We've been monitoring your activities since the day you inherited this property. We know about every conversation you've had, every place you've visited, every person you've contacted. How is that possible? Technology is a wonderful thing. Your cell phone, your apartment, your friend Elena's house, even the bank where you accessed your father's safety deposit box. We've had electronic surveillance in place for weeks." Webb's expression was smug, with the satisfaction of someone revealing the scope of his power. "We know Agent Patricia Coleman is parked a quarter mile from here, listening to this conversation through the recording device you're wearing." Jake's hand involuntarily moved toward his chest, confirming what Webb already knew. "Oh yes, we detected that the moment you walked through the door. Radio frequency scanners are standard equipment for our security operations." Webb gestured to one of his associates, who approached Jake with a handheld device that beeped insistently as it neared the hidden recorder. "Take it off, Mr. Matthews. Our conversation is about to become much more candid, and we wouldn't want the FBI to hear anything that might upset them." Jake hesitated, understanding that removing the recording device would eliminate Agent Coleman's ability to monitor his safety. But the alternative, refusing to comply with people who clearly had no intention of allowing him to leave the gas station alive, seemed worse. He pulled the recording device from beneath his shirt and placed it on the table, where Webb immediately crushed it beneath the heel of his expensive shoe. "There," Webb said with satisfaction. "Now we can speak freely. Mr. Matthews, I want you to understand something very important. Your father wasn't the hero you think he was. What do you mean? Webb opened one of the filing cabinets and removed a thick folder labeled Robert Matthews, Confidential. Your father was our informant for 3 years before he disappeared. He provided us with information about other landowners who were asking questions about mineral rights, helped us identify people who might cause problems for our operations. Jake stared at the folder, feeling like the ground was shifting beneath his feet. That's not possible. Your father was deep in debt, Mr. Matthews, gambling debts, specifically. He owed money to some very unpleasant people, and we offered him a way out. In exchange for information and cooperation, we paid his debts and provided him with a steady income. Webb opened the folder, revealing photographs, bank records, and what appeared to be signed agreements in Robert Matthews' handwriting. Walter Henning's death wasn't murder, Mr. Matthews. It was the result of information your father provided about Walter's plans to expose our business practices. Robert told us exactly when and where Walter would be driving on the night he died. Jake felt sick to his stomach. You're lying. I wish I were. Your father's guilt about Walter's death eventually became a problem for us. He started drinking heavily, became unreliable, began talking about going to the authorities. We had to make it clear that his continued cooperation was essential for his family's safety. So you forced him to leave. We gave him a choice: disappear and keep his mouth shut, or watch his wife and son suffer the consequences of his betrayal. Webb's voice carried the casual cruelty of someone who'd spent years destroying families. Robert chose to protect you and your mother. In that sense, I suppose he was heroic. Jake sank into a chair, overwhelmed by the revelation that everything he'd believed about his father's sacrifice might be built on a foundation of lies and betrayal. The evidence in the safety deposit box, carefully edited to make Robert look like a victim rather than a collaborator. Your father was many things, Mr. Matthews, but he wasn't stupid. He knew that if he disappeared without explanation, you might eventually come looking for answers. So he created a narrative that cast him as the hero of his own story. Webb walked around the table to stand directly in front of Jake, his expression a mixture of pity and calculation. But here's the truly interesting part, Mr. Matthews. None of that matters anymore, because Agent Patricia Coleman isn't just an FBI investigator, she's my wife. The room seemed to spin around Jake as he processed what Webb had just revealed. What? Is Sarah Coleman? She uses her maiden name professionally, has been working undercover for us for the past 5 years. Her assignment was to monitor federal investigations into corporate activities in this region and to identify potential threats to our operations. Jake's mind reeled as he tried to make sense of what he was hearing. Agent Coleman is married to you? She's the one who alerted us to your phone call 3 days ago. She's the one who suggested we let you believe you were conducting an undercover operation while we gathered evidence of your intentions to interfere with our business. Webb's smile was triumphant. Your entire plan to expose Meridian Oil Company was orchestrated by us from the very beginning. But she examined the evidence. She believed my father's story. She examined evidence we allowed her to see, and she responded exactly as we scripted her to respond. You never had any real power in this situation, Mr. Matthews. You were just playing a role we wrote for you. Jake felt everything he'd believed about the past week crumbling around him. The FBI investigation, Agent Coleman's support, even Elena's research, all of it had been manipulated by people who'd been controlling the situation from the very beginning. What do you want from me? Webb returned to his chair, settling back with the satisfaction of someone who'd successfully revealed the scope of his power. We want you to sign over all mineral rights to the property. We want you to sell us the gas station for a nominal fee, and we want you to disappear from Millbrook with your son, never to return or contact anyone here again. And if I refuse, then you'll suffer the same fate as Walter Henning and the other landowners who thought they could stand in our way. The difference is that we've learned from experience your death will look completely accidental, and there will be no evidence connecting it to Meridian Oil Company. Jake looked around the gas station that had become his trap, understanding that he'd walked into a situation he had no power to control. But in the midst of his despair, one thought burned bright. Tommy was safe in Vermont, far from the reach of these people, and no matter what happened here tonight, his son would survive. "I need time to think about this," Jake said. Webb checked his expensive watch with theatrical precision. "You have until midnight, Mr. Matthews. That gives you approximately 4 hours to make the most important decision of your life." As Jake prepared to leave the gas station, Webb called after him with casual menace. "Oh, and Mr. Matthews, don't bother trying to contact anyone for help. We're monitoring all communication in and out of Millbrook. Any attempt to seek assistance will be interpreted as a hostile act, and we'll respond accordingly." Jake walked out into the night air, feeling like a man who'd just learned that everything he'd believed about his life was a carefully constructed lie. But as he made his way back toward town, one truth crystallized in his mind. If he was going to die tonight, he was going to die fighting for something that mattered. Jake walked through the dark streets of Millbrook, feeling like a man who'd just discovered he was living in a nightmare that someone else had been writing for years. Every shadow could hide surveillance equipment. Every passing car could belong to Meridian's network of watchers. Every person he'd trusted might be part of an elaborate deception designed to destroy him. But as the initial shock of Webb's revelations began to fade, Jake's mind started working with the desperate clarity that comes to people who have nothing left to lose. If everything Webb had told him was true, if his father had been a collaborator, if Agent Coleman was working for Meridian, if the entire FBI investigation had been a setup, then Jake was completely alone against an organization that had spent decades perfecting the art of destroying anyone who stood in their way. But there was one thing Webb might not have considered. Jake Matthews had been fighting for survival his entire adult life, and he'd learned that sometimes the only way to win an impossible battle was to change the rules of engagement. Instead of returning to his apartment, Jake made his way to Frank Morrison's garage, using back alleys and side streets to avoid the main roads where Meridian's surveillance was most likely concentrated. Frank lived in a small apartment above his shop, and Jake knew the old mechanic well enough to predict that he'd still be awake, probably working on some project that required the focused attention that came with solitude. Jake found Frank bent over an engine block, surrounded by parts and tools arranged with the precision of a surgeon's instruments. The older man looked up as Jake entered, immediately sensing that something was seriously wrong. "Jake, what's happened? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Frank, I need your help, and I need you to listen to everything I'm about to tell you without asking questions until I'm finished." Jake settled onto a workbench, gathering his thoughts before beginning the most important conversation of his life. 3 days ago, I thought I knew who I was and what my father had done. Tonight, I found out that everything I believed was a lie designed to get me killed. Over the next hour, Jake told Frank everything: the hidden documents, the oil reserves, his father's supposed collaboration with Meridian, Agent Coleman's betrayal, and Webb's ultimatum. Frank listened without interruption, his expression growing more troubled with each revelation. "Jake," Frank said finally, "that's the most insane story I've ever heard, but it's also the only explanation that makes sense of what's been happening around here for the past month." "What do you mean?" Frank wiped his hands on a shop rag, organizing his thoughts with the methodical approach he applied to everything. "New faces in town asking questions about you and Tommy. Phone calls to my shop from people claiming to be insurance investigators. Someone broke into the diner last week and didn't steal anything, just went through Mrs. Chen's customer files. Even Sheriff Martinez mentioned that he'd been getting pressure from state authorities to drop any investigation into the vandalism at your gas station." Jake felt a mixture of vindication and terror. "So it's all true. They've been watching everyone connected to me." "Looks that way. But Jake, there's something else you need to know." Frank's expression was grim. "That Agent Coleman who's been helping you? She's not who she claims to be. Webb told me she's his wife, working undercover for Meridian." "That's not the whole truth." Frank pulled out a cell phone that looked older than anything Jake had seen in years. This phone doesn't connect to the internet, doesn't have GPS, can't be tracked by the kind of surveillance equipment these people use. I keep it for emergencies, and tonight qualifies." Frank dialed a number from memory, waiting while it rang several times before someone answered. "Patricia, it's Frank Morrison in Millbrook. We need to talk about Jake Matthews and the situation with Meridian Oil Company." Jake stared at Frank in confusion. "Who are you calling?" Frank held up a finger, continuing his conversation. "No, Patricia, I know what he was told, but the situation is more complex than anyone realized. Jake needs to know the truth about who you really are before he makes any decisions that can't be undone." After Frank hung up, he turned to Jake with an expression that mixed apology with determination. "Jake, Agent Patricia Coleman is your ex-wife, Sarah." The words hit Jake like a physical blow. "That's impossible. Sarah works for an insurance company in Pittsburgh. She's not an FBI agent." "She's been undercover for the past 5 years, Jake. The divorce, the custody battles, even her hostility toward you. It was all part of her cover to investigate Meridian Oil Company. The FBI suspected corporate corruption in this region, but they needed someone who could get close to the situation without arousing suspicion." Jake sank onto a stool, his mind reeling. "You're telling me that my ex-wife has been lying to me for 5 years? That our divorce was fake? Not fake, but strategically necessary. Sarah volunteered for this assignment because she knew it was the only way to protect you and Tommy from people who'd already killed to protect their secrets." Frank's voice was gentle but firm. "She's been watching over you from a distance, making sure Meridian never got too close to your family. But Webb said she was working for them, that she's married to him." Webb is lying, Jake. He's trying to destroy your faith in the one person who's been protecting you." Frank pulled out a photograph from his wallet, showing a much younger Sarah in what appeared to be an FBI graduation ceremony. "Sarah Coleman, she uses her maiden name professionally, has been building a federal case against Meridian for years. Your father's evidence was the final piece she needed." Jake stared at the photograph, trying to reconcile the woman he'd thought he knew with the federal agent who'd apparently been orchestrating an elaborate investigation around him. "Why didn't she tell me?" "Because the moment you knew the truth, your behavior would have changed. Meridian has been watching you closely enough to detect any shift in your routine, any change in your emotional state. Sarah needed you to react naturally to everything that happened, including her apparent betrayal of your trust." Frank's phone rang, and he answered it immediately. "Patricia, he's here." "Yes," I told him. "No, I think he's ready to hear the rest of it." Frank handed the phone to Jake, who took it with trembling hands. "Jake?" Sarah's voice was soft, carrying undertones of emotion he'd never heard from her before. "I know this is overwhelming, but I need you to listen very carefully. Your life depends on understanding what's really happening." "Sarah, is it true? Are you really an FBI agent?" "Yes, I've been investigating Meridian Oil Company since before we met. Our relationship, our marriage, Tommy's birth, those were real, Jake. But when the FBI offered me this assignment, I knew it was the only way to protect our family from people who'd already demonstrated their willingness to commit murder." Jake closed his eyes, trying to process revelations that kept reshaping everything he'd believed about his life. "The divorce was necessary to establish my cover identity and to create distance between us that would protect you from the investigation. Jake, I've spent 5 years watching you struggle as a single father, wanting to help but knowing that any contact could expose the operation and put you in danger. And tonight, when Webb told me you were his wife?" Sarah's voice hardened with professional anger. "Webb is trying to isolate you, to convince you that you have no allies and no options except surrender. He's counting on you to give up without a fight because you think everyone you trusted has betrayed you." "So, what's the truth? What's really happening?" "The truth is that we have Webb exactly where we want him. Everything he told you tonight was recorded by surveillance equipment that he doesn't know exists. His admission that Meridian has been monitoring federal investigations, his threats against your life, his description of their operations, all of it is admissible evidence in federal court. Jake felt a surge of hope cutting through his despair. You were listening? Every word. Jake, your father wasn't a collaborator. Webb was lying about that too. Robert Matthews was our informant, helping us gather evidence against Meridian while they thought he was working for them. When his cover was blown, we had to get him out of town quickly to protect his life. But he never contacted us again. He let us believe he'd abandoned the family. Sarah's voice broke slightly, because Meridian made it clear that any contact with you or your mother would result in both of your deaths. Your father spent 26 years in witness protection, Jake. He died believing he'd never see his son again, but knowing that his sacrifice had kept you safe. Jake wiped tears from his eyes, finally understanding the magnitude of his father's sacrifice and the complexity of the forces that had shaped his life. Sarah, what happens now? Now we finish what your father started. Webb gave you until midnight to make a decision, but he doesn't know that we've already made ours. At exactly 11:45 p.m., federal agents are going to raid Sunset Gas Station and arrest everyone involved in Meridian's criminal enterprise. Jake checked his watch. 10:30 p.m. What do you need me to do? I need you to go back to the gas station and continue the charade. Pretend you're considering Webb's offer while our agents get into position. But Jake, I need you to understand the risk. If Webb suspects the truth before our people are ready, he might decide to eliminate you immediately rather than wait for your decision. Sarah, if something goes wrong tonight. Nothing's going wrong, Jake. You've been alone in this fight for too long, but you're not alone anymore. Tommy is safe in Vermont with Elena's sister. I'm coordinating federal agents who've been preparing for this operation for months, and in less than 2 hours, the people who destroyed your father's life will be in federal custody. Frank took the phone back and had a brief, quiet conversation with Sarah before hanging up. Jake, Frank said, Sarah wants you to know that when this is over, when Meridian is destroyed and the criminals are in prison, you'll have choices to make about your future. The FBI will offer you witness protection if you want it, but they'll also give you the option of staying in Millbrook and rebuilding your life here. Do it. And Sarah? Frank smiled for the first time since Jake had arrived at the garage. Sarah's been waiting 5 years for the chance to be your wife again, instead of Agent Coleman. But that's a conversation you'll have with her after we've dealt with Webb and his people. Jake stood up, feeling strength returning to his body as the truth replaced the lies that had been weighing him down. Frank, will you help me get ready for this? I need to go back to that gas station and convince Webb that I'm beaten, that I'm ready to surrender everything my father died protecting. Jake, your father didn't die protecting that property. He died protecting you and Tommy. Tonight, you get the chance to honor that sacrifice by finishing the fight he started. At 11:15 p.m., Jake walked back towards Sunset Gas Station, carrying the weight of 26 years of family secrets and the hope that justice delayed was not justice denied. The recording device Frank had given him was hidden in his boot, and Sarah's voice echoed in his memory, "You're not alone anymore." As the broken neon sign came into view, Jake thought about Tommy sleeping safely in Vermont, about his father's sacrifice finally being vindicated, and about the possibility that his family might finally have the peace they'd been seeking for more than 2 decades. In 30 minutes, Marcus Webb would learn that some fights are worth finishing, regardless of the cost. Jake approached Sunset Gas Station at 11:40 p.m. with the measured steps of a man walking toward his own execution. The property was ablaze with portable lights that turned the desolate lot into something resembling a movie set. And he could see Webb's people moving around the building with the efficient purposefulness of professionals securing a location. Marcus Webb emerged from the main building as Jake crossed the parking lot, his expensive suit somehow still immaculate despite hours spent in a run-down gas station. Behind him, the younger associate and 2 additional men formed a semicircle that suggested this conversation would not be as civil as their previous meetings. "Mr. Matthews," Webb called out with mock warmth, "you're cutting it rather close to our deadline. I was beginning to worry that you might try to do something foolish." Jake forced his expression into what he hoped looked like defeat mixed with resignation. "I've been thinking about what you said, about my options. I realize I don't have any good choices." "Realism is the beginning of wisdom, Mr. Matthews. I'm pleased that you've come to understand your situation." Webb gestured toward the gas station. "Shall we go inside and formalize our agreement?" As they walked toward the building, Jake noticed movement in the shadows beyond the reach of the portable lights. Sarah had said federal agents would be in position by 11:45, and Jake hoped the figures he'd glimpsed were FBI surveillance teams rather than additional Meridian security. Inside the gas station, Webb had arranged the mobile command center like a corporate boardroom, with legal documents spread across a table and laptop computers displaying what appeared to be financial records. The transformation was complete. Robert Matthews' abandoned gas station had become the headquarters for a criminal organization worth hundreds of millions of dollars. "Before we proceed," Webb said, settling into his chair with the satisfaction of someone about to complete a successful negotiation, "I want you to understand exactly what you're agreeing to. You'll sign over all mineral rights to this property for the sum of $1. You'll sell the surface property to a Meridian subsidiary for $10,000, enough money to relocate you and your son, but not enough to live comfortably for very long." Jake took the offered chair, noting that Webb's associates had positioned themselves to block the exits. "What guarantee do I have that you'll leave me and Tommy alone after I sign these papers?" Webb's smile was cold and predatory. "Mr. Matthews, you're hardly in a position to demand guarantees, but I'll give you one anyway. As long as you disappear from this region and never speak to anyone about Meridian Oil Company, you and your son will be allowed to live quiet, unremarkable lives somewhere far from here. And if I refuse to sign, then you'll join your father in whatever afterlife awaits men who thought they could stand against forces larger than themselves." Webb's voice carried the casual menace of someone who'd delivered similar ultimatums before. "The choice is yours, Mr. Matthews, but the consequences are non-negotiable." "A non-negotiable." Jake reached for the pen Webb offered, then hesitated as if struck by a sudden thought. "Can I ask you something? Why is this property so important to Meridian? I mean, there's oil under half the state. Why risk so much for one gas station?" Webb's expression shifted to something resembling genuine enthusiasm, the reaction of someone who enjoyed explaining his own cleverness. "Because this isn't just about oil, Mr. Matthews. Your father's property sits on top of the largest untapped reserve in Pennsylvania, potentially worth over $200 million. But more importantly, it's the keystone property in a network of mineral rights that we've been assembling for 30 years. Network? We control drilling rights to over 15,000 acres in this region, all acquired through various means over the past 3 decades. But your father's property is the access point, the only location where we can legally establish the infrastructure necessary to extract oil from the entire network." Webb's pride in his organization's achievements was evident. "Without this property, our 30-year investment becomes worthless." Jake feigned impressed recognition. "So you've been planning this for decades?" "Since 1987. When our geological surveys first identified the scope of the reserves. We've acquired properties through purchase when possible, legal pressure when necessary, and more direct methods when landowners proved uncooperative." "Direct methods?" Webb's smile became predatory. "Walter Henning was the first to discover our pattern of property acquisition. He started asking questions, researching our business practices, contacting other landowners about organizing resistance to our operations. We tried to reason with him, but he was stubborn. So you killed him." "We eliminated a threat to a multi-million-dollar operation." Walter's death sent a clear message to other potential troublemakers. Cooperation was rewarded. Resistance was fatal. Webb's tone was matter-of-fact, as if discussing routine business operations. "Your father understood the message and chose cooperation over martyrdom." Jake felt sick hearing Webb casually admit to murder, but he forced himself to continue the conversation. "My father worked for you?" "Robert provided us with information about other landowners, helped us identify people who might cause problems, assisted with our acquisition strategies. In return, we paid him well and allowed him to maintain the illusion that he was protecting his family." "But he kept evidence against you," Webb laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Your father was many things, but he wasn't a saint. He documented our activities as insurance against the day when we might decide he'd outlived his usefulness. Unfortunately for Robert, we discovered his insurance policy before he could use it. Is that why he left town? We gave him a choice: disappear and keep his evidence to himself, or watch his wife and son suffer the consequences of his betrayal. Robert chose exile over revenge, which was probably the smartest decision he ever made." Jake glanced at his watch. 11:47 p.m. Where were the federal agents Sarah had promised? What about the other landowners who died? Were they all accidents? Webb's expression grew coldly pleased, the look of someone who enjoyed recounting his victories. Thomas Bradley, in 1989 brake failure while driving through the mountains. Margaret Foster in 1991 gas leak explosion that destroyed her farmhouse. David Chen in 1993 hunting accident during deer season. Webb ticked off the names like items on a grocery list. Each death appeared accidental. Each property became available for purchase shortly afterward. Each acquisition brought us closer to controlling the entire oil field. And now you have everything except my property. Now we have everything, Mr. Matthews. Your signature on these documents will complete a 30-year project worth more than most people can imagine." Webb pushed the papers across the table. "Sign them, and you get to live. Refuse, and you become another unfortunate accident in our company's history." Jake picked up the pen, noting that his hand was shaking, though whether from fear or adrenaline, he couldn't tell. "Before I sign, I need to know one more thing. What happens to the people in Millbrook when you start drilling? This is a small community. Industrial oil extraction will destroy everything they've built here." Webb's shrug was dismissive. "Small towns die all the time, Mr. Matthews. Millbrook is already dying. We're simply accelerating an inevitable process. The people who matter will find opportunities with our operation. The people who don't matter will move somewhere else." "You're talking about destroying an entire community." "I'm talking about progress, Mr. Matthews. Oil extraction brings jobs, tax revenue, economic development. Some people benefit, others don't. That's capitalism." Jake looked at the papers in front of him, thinking about Mrs. Chen's diner, Frank Morrison's garage, Elena Rodriguez's historical society, and all the other small businesses and families that would be swept away by Meridian's vision of progress. Then he thought about his father's 26 years of exile, Walter Henning's murder, and the other landowners who died because they'd stood in the way of corporate greed. "Mr. Webb," Jake said, setting down the pen without signing, "I have one more question for you." Webb's expression shifted to irritation. "Mr. Matthews, you're testing my patience. Sign the papers or face the consequences." Jake smiled for the first time since entering the gas station. "My question is this. How does it feel to know that everything you've just admitted is being recorded by federal surveillance equipment, and that FBI agents are surrounding this building right now?" Webb's face went white as the implications of Jake's words sank in. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the end of Meridian Oil Company's 30-year crime spree. I'm talking about justice for my father, for Walter Henning, and for all the other people you've murdered for money." Jake stood up from his chair, feeling stronger than he had in years. "And I'm talking about the fact that you're all under arrest." The building erupted in chaos as Webb's associates reached for weapons, while floodlights suddenly blazed outside the windows and amplified voices began shouting, "FBI, everyone on the ground!" The front door of Sunset gas station exploded inward as federal agents stormed the building with the coordinated precision of a military operation. Jake dove behind an overturned table as Webb's associates drew weapons, their corporate facade crumbling to reveal the violent criminals underneath. FBI, drop your weapons! The commands echoed through the building as tactical lights cut through the darkness, creating a strobing effect that turned the abandoned gas station into a war zone. Marcus Webb pulled a pistol from inside his suit jacket, his composed businessman's demeanor replaced by desperate fury. "You think this is over, Matthews? You think arresting a few people will stop what we've built?" Jake kept low behind his makeshift shelter as gunfire erupted around him. "It stops tonight, Webb. Your 30-year crime spree ends here." The younger associate who'd accompanied Webb to their earlier meetings was backing toward a rear exit, firing at the advancing FBI agents while shouting into a radio headset. "Code Red, federal raid in progress. Initiate containment protocols." Agent Sarah Coleman's voice cut through the chaos with professional authority. "Marcus Webb, you're under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, racketeering, and murder. Surrender now and you might live to see trial." Webb's response was another burst of gunfire in Sarah's direction, forcing her to take cover behind a concrete pillar. 26 years I've been planning this operation. I'm not letting some small-town mechanic and his FBI whore destroy everything." Jake felt rage surge through his chest at Webb's words about Sarah. Rising from cover, he grabbed a heavy wrench from Robert's old toolbox and hurled it across the room, striking Webb in the shoulder and spinning him around. The distraction was enough for Agent Coleman to advance, her weapon trained on Webb's center mass. "Drop it, Marcus. It's over." But Webb's desperation had crossed the line into madness. Instead of surrendering, he turned his weapon toward Jake with the clear intention of eliminating the man who'd destroyed his life's work. The gunshot that followed echoed through the gas station like thunder, but it wasn't Webb who fired. Agent Coleman's shot took him center mass, and Marcus Webb collapsed to the concrete floor of Sunset gas station, his blood mingling with decades of oil stains and automotive grease. The battle lasted less than 3 minutes. When the smoke cleared, 2 of Webb's associates were dead, one was seriously wounded and in FBI custody, and Marcus Webb was breathing his last breaths while cursing Jake's name. Sarah holstered her weapon and rushed to Jake's side, her professional composure cracking as she pulled him into an embrace that felt like coming home after a 5-year absence. "Jake, are you hurt? Are you okay?" "I'm fine." "Sarah, I'm so sorry about everything, the divorce, the years of thinking you'd abandoned us, not understanding what you were trying to do." Sarah's tears mixed with the dust and smoke that filled the air. "You have nothing to apologize for. I'm the one who left, who let you struggle alone while I played spy games with murderers and criminals." Jake held her tightly, feeling pieces of his broken world clicking back into place. "You were protecting Tommy and me. You were finishing what my father started." Around them, federal agents were securing the crime scene and documenting evidence that would ensure Meridian Oil Company's surviving executives faced federal prosecution. Computers were seized, files were photographed, and the mobile command center that Webb had installed was dismantled piece by piece. Agent Rodriguez, Sarah's partner in the undercover operation, approached them with a briefcase full of documents. "Sarah, you need to see this." Webb's computers contain financial records, communication logs, and operational details for Meridian's activities going back 15 years. This is enough evidence to prosecute dozens of co-conspirators. Sarah wiped her eyes and resumed her professional bearing, though she kept one hand on Jake's arm, as if to assure herself he was really there. "What about the property rights? What about the oil reserves?" According to the documents we've recovered, Jake Matthews is the legal owner of mineral rights worth approximately $200 million. Meridian's entire operation was built on fraudulent land acquisitions and forged contracts. Agent Rodriguez smiled at Jake. "Mr. Matthews, you're about to become a very wealthy man." Jake looked around the gas station, where his father had hidden evidence for 26 years, where Marcus Webb had planned the destruction of an entire community, where federal agents had finally brought justice to people who'd thought themselves above the law. "I don't want the money," Jake said. "Not all of it, anyway." Sarah stared at him in surprise. "Jake, this is your family's legacy. This is what your father died protecting." "My father died protecting his family and his community. The money is just a tool. What matters is how we use it." Jake gestured toward the broken windows and cracked concrete of Sunset Gas Station. "I want to use part of it to restore this place, to turn it into something that honors the people Webb murdered and the community he tried to destroy." "What did you have in mind?" Jake thought about Mrs. Chen's struggling diner, Frank Morrison's aging garage, Elena Rodriguez's underfunded historical society, and all the other small businesses that formed the heart of Millbrook. A community center, a place where people can learn about local history, where small businesses can get support, where families like mine can find help when they need it. Sarah smiled through her tears. "Your father would be proud of the man you've become." As dawn broke over Millbrook, Jake stood outside Sunset Gas Station watching federal agents load evidence into unmarked vans. The building looked different in the morning light, not like an abandoned ruin, but like a place where something important had ended and something better was about to begin. His phone rang, and Elena Rodriguez's voice carried across the miles from Vermont with joy and relief. "Jake, I just spoke with Sarah. Tommy wants to talk to you." Jake's chest tightened with emotion as his son's voice came through the phone. "Dad, is it over? Are the bad men gone?" "It's over, buddy. The bad men can't hurt anyone anymore. And Tommy, your grandpa Robert, was a hero. He spent his whole life fighting to protect us, and now we're going to finish what he started. Can I come home now?" Jake looked at Sarah, who was coordinating with federal agents while keeping one eye on him at all times. "Yeah, buddy, you can come home, and this time we're all going to be together." As he hung up the phone, Jake realized that for the first time in his adult life, he was looking forward to tomorrow. 6 months later, Jake Matthews stood in front of Sunset Gas Station, watching a crew of workers hang a banner that read, "Robert Matthews Community Center, Grand Opening." The building had been transformed from a derelict reminder of economic decline into a beacon of hope for Millbrook's future. Fresh paint covered walls that had once been cracked and stained, new windows replaced sheets of plywood, and the old gas pumps had been converted into historical displays commemorating the town's automotive heritage. Tommy ran across the parking lot with the boundless energy of a 9-year-old who'd spent the morning helping Elena Rodriguez arrange historical exhibits in what had once been his grandfather's office. "Dad," Mrs. Rodriguez says the museum part is ready, and Mrs. Chen wants to know if you've tried the cake she made for the opening. Jake smiled, watching his son with the relaxed joy of a father who no longer worried about surveillance, threats, or men in expensive suits appearing without warning. "Tell Mrs. Chen I'll be right there, buddy. And see if you can find your mom. I think she's in the garage talking to Frank about the automotive training program." The word "mom" still felt strange coming from Tommy's lips, but Sarah had transitioned from undercover FBI agent back to family member with remarkable grace. The legal proceedings to restore their marriage had been complicated by 5 years of separation and false documentation. But federal prosecutors had been surprisingly helpful when they'd learned that family reunification was part of the witness protection arrangements. Jake walked through the community center, marveling at how completely the space had been transformed. The main area where Webb had operated his criminal command center now housed computers where local residents could search for jobs, take online classes, and connect with resources for small business development. The back room, where Jake had discovered his father's hidden evidence, had become a meeting space for everything, from town council sessions to support groups for struggling families. Elena Rodriguez emerged from the historical museum section carrying a framed photograph of Robert Matthews standing beside the original Sunset gas station in 1987. "Jake, I found one more picture in your father's belongings. I thought you might want to see this before the ceremony starts." The photograph showed Robert Matthews as Jake had never seen him. Young, hopeful, proud of the business he'd built and the future he'd planned for his family. Behind him, the gas station gleamed with fresh paint and new equipment, a symbol of American entrepreneurship and small-town dreams. "He looked happy," Jake observed, running his fingers over the frame. He was happy for a while. Before Meridian started pressuring him, before Walter Henning was murdered, before he realized that protecting his family meant sacrificing his own happiness. Elena's voice carried the weight of someone who'd spent months researching the complicated truth about Robert Matthews's life. "Your father made the hardest choice a man can make, Jake. He chose love over justice, family over revenge, protection over vindication. Gone. And I got to choose differently because of his sacrifice." Exactly. He lived in exile so you could live in freedom. He kept silent so you could speak the truth. He disappeared so you could stay home and build the life he'd always wanted for his family. Frank Morrison's voice boomed across the community center as he tested the sound system for the grand opening ceremony. "Testing, testing. Jake, can you hear me okay? We've got about 50 people here already, and cars are still pulling into the parking lot." Jake looked out the window and felt his chest swell with pride. The parking lot was filling with residents of Millbrook and surrounding communities, people who'd come to celebrate not just the opening of a community center, but the transformation of a place that had once symbolized corporate greed and small-town decay into something that represented hope and renewal. Sarah appeared at Jake's side, wearing a simple blue dress that made her look more like a small-town mother than a federal agent who'd spent 5 years infiltrating criminal organizations. "The automotive training program is going to start with 12 students next month. Frank thinks he can prepare them for certification in 6 months, and there are already 3 local garages interested in hiring graduates. What about the oil extraction? Any word from the federal regulators?" Sarah's expression grew serious. "The EPA has approved a limited extraction plan that will provide steady income for the community without destroying the environment. The drilling will be restricted to areas away from residential neighborhoods, and all profits above operating costs will go into a trust fund for community development." Jake nodded, satisfied that the wealth beneath Sunset gas station would benefit Millbrook rather than enrich corporate criminals. "And Meridian Oil Company?" "Completely dismantled. 23 executives and associates have been convicted on federal charges, ranging from fraud to conspiracy to commit murder. The company's assets have been liquidated, and victim compensation funds have been established for the families of people like Walter Henning." Tommy appeared beside them, carrying a slice of Mrs. Chen's cake that was almost as large as his head. "Dad, people are asking when the ceremony is going to start. And Mrs. Henderson from the pharmacy wants to know if you're going to give a speech." Jake looked at his son, his wife, and the community that had embraced them, despite the dangerous secrets that had nearly destroyed everything. In the distance, he could see the hills where Robert Matthews had once imagined building a prosperous future for his family, before corporate greed and criminal violence had forced him to choose between justice and love. "Yeah, buddy, I think I have a few things to say." The ceremony began at sunset, with Jake standing behind a podium that had been positioned where the old gas pumps once dispensed fuel to travelers passing through Millbrook. The crowd included faces he'd known his entire life, and others he was just beginning to recognize, new residents drawn by job opportunities, federal officials monitoring the community development project, and reporters documenting the story of how a struggling single father had exposed a multi-million-dollar criminal conspiracy. "Friends and neighbors," Jake began, his voice carrying clearly across the parking lot in the still evening air. 6 months ago, this place represented everything that was wrong with our community. Tonight, it represents everything that's right about the people who refuse to give up on each other and their hometown. He paused, looking at Tommy, who sat in the front row between Sarah and Elena, his face glowing with pride in his father's accomplishments. My father, Robert Matthews, built this gas station with dreams of prosperity and community. When criminals tried to steal those dreams, he made the hardest choice a man can make. He sacrificed his own happiness to protect his family and preserve the evidence that would eventually bring justice to people who thought they were above the law. Jake's voice grew stronger as he continued. Tonight, we're not just opening a community center. We're proving that ordinary people can stand up to extraordinary evil and win. We're showing that small towns like Millbrook don't have to die just because powerful corporations decide they're inconvenient. We're demonstrating that justice delayed is not justice denied. The applause that followed felt like thunder rolling across the hills, and Jake understood that he was witnessing something larger than a ribbon-cutting ceremony. This was a community declaring its intention to survive and thrive despite the forces that had tried to destroy it. As the evening wound down and people began to drift back to their homes and businesses, Jake found himself standing alone in the parking lot where this entire journey had begun. The broken neon sign had been replaced with elegant LED lighting that spelled out Robert Matthews Community Center in letters that could be seen from Highway 9. Sarah joined him, slipping her hand into his with the comfortable familiarity of people who'd found their way back to each other after a long and difficult journey. "Any regrets?" she asked. Jake thought about the question, considering everything they'd lost and gained over the past 6 months. "I regret that my father never got to see Tommy grow up. I regret that it took 26 years for the truth to come out. I regret that good people like Walter Henning had to die for money and corporate greed. But no regrets about the choices you made?" Jake looked at the community center, where lights still glowed in windows that showed people using computers, reading books, and planning projects that would benefit their neighbors. He thought about Tommy, who was growing up in a world where justice existed and families stayed together. He thought about Sarah, who'd sacrificed 5 years of her life to protect them and ensure that criminals faced consequences for their actions. "No regrets about the choices," Jake said finally. "Sometimes the hardest decisions turn out to be the most important ones. Sometimes standing up to people who seem impossible to defeat is the only way to discover that they're not as powerful as they want you to believe." In the distance, Tommy's laughter echoed across the parking lot as he played with children from the neighborhood, their voices carrying on the evening breeze like a promise that the future would be different from the past. Jake squeezed Sarah's hand and smiled as he watched his son run toward them, carrying in his young face the hope that previous generations had fought to preserve and protect. "Come on," Jake said to his family, "let's go home." And for the first time in 26 years, Robert Matthews' family walked away from Sunset Gas Station together, their footsteps echoing with the sound of justice finally served and dreams finally fulfilled.